Carl Jung was an explorer of the human psyche, someone who dared to face the shadows of existence and reveal uncomfortable truths. Unlike many philosophies that encourage only kindness and altruism, Jung understood that human nature is dual and that ignoring its darker side can be a fatal mistake. His ideas are not for the faint of heart. He asks us to look within, where our weaknesses, resentments, and even destructive impulses lie hidden. If you consider yourself a good person, this video might be a challenge. Because the advice Jung would leave us is not sweet, not comforting. It is hard truth, but absolutely necessary for those who wish to become more complete and authentic human beings. One of the greatest dangers for those who see themselves as good people is believing that their morality is beyond question. Jung would warn us that excessive kindness can hide unconscious motivations, guilt, a desire for acceptance, fear of conflict. In other words, being a good person might actually be a disguise to avoid the harsh reality of one's own imperfections. Jung would call this the persona, the social mask we wear to be accepted, but behind it lies the shadow, the part of us that we reject and suppress. And the more a person insists on seeing themselves as entirely good, the more their shadow grows in the unconscious, acting in a self-sabotaging way. Many extremely kind people, always willing to help others, actually carry deep resentment. Why? Because they sacrifice themselves excessively, expecting recognition, expecting the world to treat them the same way. But Jung teaches us that life does not automatically reward kindness. And more, the more a person suppresses their anger, ambition, and selfish desires, the more these impulses escape in distorted ways, whether through emotional outbursts, identity crises, or psychological distress. So, Jung's first dark piece of advice would be, do not blindly trust your own goodness. Question it. Find your shadow and face it head on. This does not mean becoming a bad person, but rather a real one, someone who does not hide behind comforting illusions. A good person may see anger as something bad, something to be avoided at all costs. However, Jung believed that repressed emotions don't simply disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, turning into resentment or even physical symptoms. Anger is a powerful force. It signals when our boundaries have been crossed. It gives us the energy to fight for what matters. The problem is not anger itself, but how we use it. If we ignore our anger, it turns against us. If we express it uncontrollably, it destroys relationships and opportunities. The real balance lies in recognizing it and channeling it constructively. The same applies to selfishness. People who see themselves as good often feel guilty for thinking about their own needs. Jung would warn us that extreme altruism can be a form of escape, an unconscious fear of embracing one's own desires. Healthy selfishness is not something to be condemned. It is essential for personal growth. Jung's advice? Learn to say no without guilt. Use your anger as fuel to set boundaries. Respect your needs as much as you respect those of others. If someone asks you, what's wrong with being a good person? Your first reaction might be to reject the question entirely. But Jung, with his deep understanding of the psyche, would tell us that excessive kindness can actually be a disguised form of weakness. Why do some people insist so much on pleasing others? Often, it doesn't come from true altruism, but from a fear of confrontation, rejection, and loneliness. It's easier to always be nice than to face the possibility of disappointing someone. But the problem is that by avoiding conflict, we also give up authenticity. A truly good person is not someone who never asserts themselves, but someone who balances compassion with firmness. If you say yes to everything, if you avoid speaking your mind just to spare others' feelings, Jung would call this psychological castration, an internal block that stifles your own expression and growth. The solution? Have the courage to be uncomfortable. Learn to stand your ground, to say no without feeling the need to justify yourself. People who truly respect you won't abandon you just because you set boundaries. And if they do, perhaps they never really respected you in the first place. Jung gave us one of the most provocative concepts in psychology: the shadow. The shadow is everything we reject in ourselves. our aggressive instincts, our repressed desires, our less noble intentions. And the more we deny this dark side, the stronger it becomes in the unconscious, influencing our actions without us realizing it. If you believe you are incapable of feeling hatred, envy, or selfishness, that doesn't mean these emotions don't exist within you. It simply means you don't recognize them, and therefore you can't control them. The worst atrocities in human history were not committed by people who saw themselves as evil. On the contrary, they were carried out by those who believed they were acting for the greater good, but had completely repressed their shadow. When the shadow is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It manifests in destructive ways without the person realizing they have become its prisoner. Jung would say that the only way to prevent the shadow from taking over is to know it and integrate it consciously. This means admitting your darkest impulses, understanding them, and transforming them into something useful. If you feel envy towards someone, instead of denying it and feeling guilty, ask yourself, what is this envy telling me about what I truly want for myself? If you feel anger, instead of suppressing it, use it as a signal to recognize where your boundaries have been crossed. True goodness doesn't come from repressing evil, but from being aware of it. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be conscious. Good people often fall into the trap of expecting the world to be fair. They believe that if they are kind and do the right thing, others will do the same. But Jung would warn us that this belief can be a sign of naivety, and naivety can be dangerous. The world is not governed by good intentions. It is shaped by power, choices, and the boundaries we set. If you don't clearly define what you want and take control of your own life, others will do it for you. Whether it's an exploitative boss, a manipulative partner, or even external circumstances pushing you toward a fate you never chose. People who see themselves as good may avoid this confrontation with reality because taking control of their own destiny requires responsibility. It means recognizing that their failures are not just the fault of others or bad luck, but the result of choices, or the lack of them. Jung would say, stop expecting life to treat you fairly, stop believing that fate will come and set everything right. If you don't make decisions, someone else will make them for you. If you don't set boundaries, others will cross them. If you don't value yourself, the world won't do it for you. The first step? Accept that no one is coming to save you. That may sound frightening, but it's also liberating. Because once you become aware of this, you can change your own reality. Jung believed that personal growth does not happen in calm waters, but through facing suffering. In his view, psychological pain is not just something to be avoided. It is a gateway to transformation. But many people who consider themselves good spend their lives running from suffering. They avoid conflict, ignore their frustrations, and try to keep everything in harmony. But this superficial peace comes at a cost: disconnection from themselves. If you never face your pain, you will never become truly strong. If you never question your beliefs, you will never discover your true essence. And if you never accept that suffering is part of the process, you will never become whole. Pain can be a teacher. When we feel distress, our unconscious is trying to tell us something. It might be a warning that we are on the wrong path, that we are betraying ourselves, that something needs to change. Jung's advice? Stop running from pain and start listening to it. Instead of numbing your suffering with distractions or denying your emotions, ask yourself, what is this pain trying to teach me? Most people spend their lives trying to be only half of what they truly are. They want to be good, fair, and altruistic, rejecting any trait that seems ugly or inconvenient. But Jung teaches us that true wholeness only happens when we integrate all aspects of our personality, including the darker ones. Integrating the shadow does not mean becoming cruel or immoral, but rather recognizing its existence and using it consciously. A clear example is the difference between someone who has control over their aggressiveness and someone who represses it completely. A person who denies their own aggression can be easily manipulated because they don't know how to stand up for themselves. But someone who integrates it can use it strategically, setting clear boundaries and defending their interests without resorting to violence. Another example is ambition. Many people reject ambition because they see it as selfish. But Jung would argue that denying your ambition can be just as dangerous as overindulging in it. Without ambition, you may spend your entire life letting opportunities slip away while watching others make the decisions you could have made. No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is one of Jung's most profound statements. It reminds us that it's not enough to try to be good. We must be whole. And to do that, we must look inward and accept everything we find. If there's one truly honest piece of advice from Jung for good people, it's this: stop trying to be just good and start being real. One of Jung's most provocative ideas is that a person who has no capacity for danger can never truly be good. This may sound contradictory, but it makes perfect sense when we dig deeper. Imagine two people. The first is docile, submissive, and incapable of defending themselves. The second is strong, determined, and knows how to stand their ground, but chooses to act with ethics and fairness. Who is truly good? The first person has no choice but to be passive. They are not acting with kindness out of conscious choice, but out of fear or incapacity. The second, on the other hand, has power, but chooses to use it responsibly. That is true character. Jung believed that good people must be capable of fighting, and must be prepared to do so. This doesn't mean being violent or hostile, but developing enough inner strength to avoid being manipulated or exploited. If you've never learned to defend yourself, never confronted your own fears, and never allowed yourself to develop courage, then maybe you're just playing the role of a good person because you don't know any other way. And that is not goodness. It's weakness. So one of Jung's deepest pieces of advice would be, become dangerous, but choose to use that strength for good. What Jung teaches us is that being a good person does not mean being naive, submissive, or excessively altruistic. True goodness comes from strength, awareness, and the integration of one's own shadow. If you want to be truly good, you must first be whole. You must recognize your darker impulses, learn to handle your emotions, stop running from pain, and take control of your own life. Jung does not ask us to be perfect. He asks us to be real. And that may be the most liberating lesson we can learn.